Hello and welcome. My name is Britta Alton. I am the Director of Children's Ministries here at Ringgold United Methodist Church. I am listening in the background. You may be able to hear some of the sounds of the preschool nap time ending and children starting to move and stir on this children's hallway. The same hallway is where my two boys spent much of their childhood. When we moved here, I had a 2-year-old and an infant in a carrier. And so from day one, for me, the security and the joy that children find here were both incredibly important to me. As I walk you through our church's Safe Sanctuaries policy, I invite you to realize that there is more to ministry than meets the eye. And if you would, open an email while you watch. And along the way, I will give you a keyword here or there, and I'll just ask you to type that into your email. Save it till the very end. Once you're finished typing in all the words, I'll say, okay, send it to me. And you can send it to me, britta@ringgoldumc.org. And since keeping our kids safe in order to do ministry well is very important, I'm going to start with that being our very first keyword. As you enter the keyword safe as your first keyword, let's look at what Ringgold United Methodist Church's Safe Sanctuaries policy looks like. If you have served in any way at a United Methodist Church, you have probably encountered some type of Safe Sanctuaries policy or safe practices policies that are put into place to protect those who are vulnerable. Each church is unique, and so each church's particular practices and policies will be a little bit unique. There are 3 main reasons why you will find safe practices and policies for safety in place within a church. Because there are 3 main reasons we have these policies in place, your second word that I'd ask for you to include in your email is the word 3. Take a moment and jot that down as we continue. There are 3 main things. The first is that as believers, we go to Scripture for guidance. And you'll see here in Mark 9, verse 37, whoever welcomes one of these children welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me isn't actually welcoming me, but the one who sent me. In Matthew 18:6, this is one of the ones my kids really like because they like the ones that make you feel squeamish. Whoever causes little ones to trip and fall, it would be better to have a huge stone hung around your neck and be drowned in the bottom of the lake. It is very clear that we are not to become stumbling blocks or be harmful in any way to the children within our community. The second reason that you'll find safe practices and policies put into place is simply tradition. Especially in the Methodist Church, when a child is baptized, we make promises and covenants to so order our lives that the children would be established in their faith and strengthened along the way. None of that can happen when a child is experiencing neglect or abuse. So our tradition reminds us as well to make sure that we care for and nurture those who are vulnerable in our midst. The third reason that you'll see safe practices and policies in place is because in the 1996 General Conference, a mandate was issued that requires us to do so. The mandate has been reaffirmed by every General Conference since then. Not only does it apply to anyone under the age of 18, it also applies to those who are cognitively vulnerable or elderly that are also vulnerable. The reasons why we have a policy in place, it's as an umbrella, as a protection for our children and our youth within our church, any vulnerable adults. And it's also a protection for all paid or volunteer workers. Since we look at these protections as an umbrella over those involved, take a moment and write the word umbrella in your email to me. That will be the third word. And I specifically say paid or volunteer because it is intended to protect a great number of people, not only the paid church ministry staff or nursery workers, but people who work in recreation ministries, special needs ministries, others who volunteer for events, even scout leaders, preschool staff, and really anyone else that is involved with any of the ministries within your church. So that's a lot of conversation about why there are protections in place. It might make you ask, why are churches so at risk? Why are churches in need of this protection? There are a few reasons. One is that we, by our nature and our faith, tend to trust and look for the positive in others. We are typically less aware of the prevalence of abuse within our communities. Another reason we're at risk is because we really provide easy access to those who are not able to protect themselves and make sound judgment calls. We work very hard to make ministry accessible to everyone. And for someone who might have bad intentions, that gives easy access or fairly easy access to those that may be vulnerable. Oftentimes, we don't screen as well as other agencies do. We do screen, we do a background check on any of our people that are serving, anyone who serves here with children or vulnerable adults. Another reason that frequently churches are at risk is that we don't do enough training about appropriate interpersonal boundaries. What could happen if we do not have a safe sanctuaries policy in place? If there is no plan in place, there's often no insurance coverage. The church could be deemed negligent and an insurance company wouldn't want to cover liabilities for that church. With no safe sanctuaries practices in place, you also may encounter lawsuits based on allegations, whether they're true or false. Without proper safety guidelines being followed, you run a higher risk of those kinds of lawsuits. If there's a plan in place but it's not being followed, that also can lead to legal trouble and can put you at risk as a church. Ultimately, once a church is experiencing legal issues or concerns around the safety of the children in their care, there is oftentimes a loss of membership, a loss of church unity and church reputation, and financial loss as well. For myself, the most important part is that the life and spiritual well-being of someone could be forever altered, whether that would be a child or an adult. That is something I don't want to put at risk. Because for me, the well-being of individuals is the motivating factor. Go ahead and write down the word well-being as your fourth word in your email response to me. As an intentionally Safe Sanctuaries trained church, there are several things that we're committed to. We do screen all paid and volunteer workers. We do put in place prudent procedures in all of our programs and events. We train people regarding our policies and procedures, which is what you're doing right now. We do report suspected incidents of child abuse according to Georgia state law, and we respond appropriately to those involved if an incident occurs. We also work towards the ongoing education of our congregation to make sure that they are aware of safe practices, even if they're not serving in these areas. Now we come to what is oftentimes the most awkward or difficult part of Safe Sanctuaries training, but that is simply to make sure that anyone who serves is aware of how to identify abuse. There are several different types of abuse, and because we'll be talking about many, take a moment and write the word abuse in the email to me as your fifth word as we continue and I talk to you about a few of these types of abuse. Physical abuse, as you can see, is the deliberate or intentional bodily harm. It is not accidental. Take a few moments, read through the possible indicators of physical abuse. These are outward signs that you might make note of in observing someone who experienced physical abuse. Sexual abuse is about non-consensual sexual contact, no matter what individuals are involved. Take a few moments to look at the possible indicators that you might observe or encounter with someone who had experienced sexual abuse. Emotional abuse is the infliction of mental anguish There are a lot of different ways that that could happen, and it could be physical or simply emotional, but take a few moments to look through those possible indicators of someone who might have experienced emotional abuse. Neglect or abandonment are both types of abuse. Neglect is when care is not provided in a way that endangers an individual's health, safety, or welfare. And abandonment is simply the desertion of someone that you have assumed responsibility for care of. Read through the possible indicators for someone who might be experiencing neglect or abandonment. Ritual abuse is the regular intentional violation in a variety of ways that is done in order to appeal to a higher authority or power, whether that be something like a gang in power or even making reference to a spiritual power. Anytime someone is harmed for these reasons, that would be considered ritual abuse. Take a moment and look through those possible indicators that you might see with someone who has experienced ritual abuse. The last type of abuse that I want to mention is financial abuse or exploitation, unauthorized misuse of funds or property belonging to a vulnerable individual, whether it is an adult in senior care or a child in a foster situation. You can look through the possible indicators of what you might observe in a situation where financial abuse or exploitation is taking place. Okay, thank you for taking the time to go through that with me. I want to go on to the next part of what do you do in a situation where you believe you have observed abuse of some type. Take a moment and write down the word reporting as your sixth word. That's what we'll talk about here. There are 3 different kinds of actions that the church staff and volunteers should report. First of those is an accident. If a child falls on the playground or an adult slips at a Wednesday night supper and something happens, those in ministry leadership should be made aware of accidents that happen and should make sure to document when accidents happen. Incidents. An incident is when something is observed that does not need to be reported, but it does require attention by staff. For instance, if an individual serving in a ministry area were to just completely lose their cool, or if someone in charge left individuals unattended, that would be a safety incident. These kind of incidents definitely need to be made known to ministry leadership so that those in leadership can document and act in whatever action is determined as needed. The third thing that should always be reported is any suspected abuse. So as we talked about abuse previously, if a paid staff or volunteer worker serving in any ministry area has been told of or suspects or has observed something that would indicate suspected abuse, that should definitely be reported. We'll talk about reporting in just a moment. Anyone serving, whether it is paid staff or volunteers in ministry with children and youth, as well as any clergy, are mandatory reporters. If you have a reasonable cause to believe that a child has been abused, you are mandated to report what you have observed. This was made as a legal obligation in order to provide protection. It is not seeking to harm anyone, but to protect. You also should know that anyone making a report in good faith is immune from any civil or criminal liability. Before you spend any energy being nervous about what you may or may not have to report at any point in time, you should know that our church has a reporting plan, and I'll walk you through that. We do have in place incident reporting forms which typically someone who is serving as an unpaid ministry servant or volunteer would not have to deal with. As someone who is serving in a volunteer basis, your primary responsibility is to notify church staff or clergy immediately when there is a concern or a potential report that needs to be filed. Information and suspicions should only be discussed with appropriate church staff or clergy. This is not a time to go to others within the church and ask what they think about a concern. Go directly to your ministry leadership or your clergy, just so that you know the importance of immediately notifying leadership of concerns. Reports to DFACS must be made within 24 hours of the disclosure or the observation of something that resembles abuse. Part of our reporting plan also includes responding appropriately to anyone involved, those individuals involved, as well as media response if that is ever required. Media response is also something that should be directed toward ministry and church leadership. I'm going to show you here information about how to report, but I do want to remind you, as a person who is serving voluntarily in a ministry area, your responsibility is primarily to pass information or concern along to leadership. These are the steps that ministry leadership will follow in a situation of suspected abuse. Take a moment to read through these details, but also pause and add the word leadership as your 7th word in your response to me. The possibility of having to report any suspected abuse brings up a lot of questions. There are several bits of information on this screen that may answer some questions and may also cause questions. If you would like to jot down any questions you may have specific to how you may be serving or based upon something that you have experienced in the past, take the time to do that right now so that you don't forget. These things are important to know. Immediately means fast. Do not go home and pray about something that you've observed that is a cause for concern. Contact your ministry leadership immediately. DFACS identifies that to mean within 24 hours, they should be made aware of the concern if it does ultimately end up needing to be reported to them. Not all reports that are made to DFACS turn into an investigation. There should never be any internal investigating done with regard to suspected abuse. That should be left to agencies whose job that is. You will find that with conversations with children, sometimes timelines are not clear. You may ask some clarifying questions about whether or not a person is still in their life or if what they're talking about is current. But if a child discloses things to you from their past, DFACS will not respond to anything that happened more than 6 months ago. It's also worth noting that DFACS does only respond to situations in which it is a caregiver or a custodian of a child, not an incident between children or other underage concerns. None of those things should prevent you from reporting a concern to church leadership, but it is good to know. As we move on, take a moment to write the word policies as the 8th word on your list. Each church has policies that are put in place, but it also has practices that are not necessarily policy. Our church has a safe sanctuaries policy in place. We have a children's ministry handbook that we utilize, and there are other written guidelines within other ministry areas as well. Those are written policy. If you have not already been forwarded a digital copy of the children's ministry handbook, be sure to ask for that in the email that you send back to me after this training. There is a lot of helpful information within that handbook for anyone who serves in the children's area. You'll see on the screen a few of the things that are covered, but it is very helpful for you to have that to reference when you're serving children at our church. Take a moment now to write down our 9th word, which will be practices. Different than written policy, our practices are put in place as a means of ensuring safety as well. It is our practice to educate and train those who serve about the policies that are in place. We also have practices of having permission forms for events or trips. We also have media releases in place simply as a means to ensure that care is taken with anyone who is involved with our ministry areas. There are also common guidelines and practices about how to find a substitute teacher if you're on a teaching rotation, or the proper way of sharing or posting things online so that you are careful of others. Most of these practices are put into place as a protection. If you find that you are scheduled to serve in a certain situation, but you become sick or you become suddenly unable to serve in that way, notifying your ministry leadership and planning for trading weeks or finding a substitute are all ways that we make sure the children that come to our care have the leadership that they need within each thing they are involved with. One of the reasons we continually recruit responsible and caring adults to serve, and that really provides us a stability and allows for room for growth and security throughout that growth. We often encounter families and children with special needs of different kinds. You'll see some listed here, and we want to make sure that we respond with care and love to anything that people are experiencing in their life as we minister to them. If you look through some of these issues, you'll see they're very real. We serve God in a very real community, and we encounter people in very real need. There are some basic volunteer guidelines that you'll find as part of the Safe Sanctuaries policy. A primary volunteer is anyone who is 18 or older. We do look for involvement of 6 months or more from those who are serving. Any primary volunteers, which are 18 or older, do have to have a background check completed. All volunteers, whether you are 18 or older or a youth volunteer, all volunteers must be trained in Safe Sanctuaries. Paid staff should be trained in first aid and CPR, and when those trainings are offered, it will be made open to any serving in those areas as well. We do have in place a 2-worker or no isolation rule. Whenever a group gathers, there should be 2 people present and no one isolated. But if you're divided into small groups, you may have one group meeting with open doors or windows in the doors right across the hall from another group. You'll see that in all of our ministry areas, there are doors that have a small window in them, and you'll see on any given program time, if there's only one person in a room as a teacher, there is another person floating between ministry areas to check on and ensure the safety of everyone involved. There are other specific guidelines to youth and off-site events that you may encounter depending upon the age of your family members or the age of those that you serve. Everything that you've heard in this training or read through in Safe Sanctuaries or ministry handbook areas, everything is designed to provide safety and care that is ultimately trying to pass along the love of God to everyone we encounter. Take one last moment to look through these scenarios and think, what would you do if you encounter any of these or other situations? If you are not sure how you should or would respond, feel free to include that in your email to me asking for clarification or noting a concern you may have. With everything we do intending to show God's love, take a moment and write down our 10th word at the close of this training, and that is the word love. Be sure to go ahead and hit send on your email to me to Britta, BRITTA, at ringgoldumc.org. And I look forward to talking with you more about serving. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen and learn as we lead children along a path of knowing that they belong to God, that they are becoming like Jesus as they go, and through that they will bless others along the way. Thanks so much. I look forward to hearing from you and seeing you in ministry.